Well, I've been thinking about a couple of things, but I guess I've been thinking about, well, I've been thinking about philosophy's potential for how it relates to the realities of life. And I guess as I'm talking just right now, like something that's coming to mind, especially as it relates to grief, how does philosophy like speak to it or assist, if you will? But I think that what I'm thinking about is how philosophy seems to be able to do a lot of the work to prepare. Like, we talk a lot about preparation versus planning, etc. And I do think that it seems as though philosophy may uniquely help in the preparation, which of course is then also the now is the future in a sense, like because it's always transferring into that. So, um, yeah, I think that that is a way to think about philosophy's role in times of grief. I mean, also for much of human history, theology and philosophy were the same thing. So I think theology obviously has particular ways to handle or to know how to face grief, loss, hardship, and it typically also has like maybe rituals or processes communally that it like allows or affords. So yeah, I think that it's all, obviously that is still philosophy too, right? It's just that it might get aligned more with like a particular like religious system. But yeah, I guess I've just been thinking about that. I mean, I think another unique thing that philosophy might be able to do in times of grief, which the theology does in a different way, but kind of parallels, is to be able to actually try to suspend judgment as best as you can, even though everything in your human nature wants to or will feel like you inevitably have a type of reaction, you have a type of essentially, it's a judgment in the sense of you judge something to be difficult, you judge something to be not right, you judge something to be hard, you judge something to be insurmountable or feel insurmountable. So yeah, I think that yeah, that could also be the unique role of philosophy. And I'm thinking about that as it relates to also witnessing other people who maybe explicitly maybe give more of their time to philosophy that in that way, like everybody does actually, but yeah, explicitly that how they've used that in their times of dealing with hardships. So
Yeah, it's this weird thing where, as always with philosophy, it seems obvious that it's important, and then when you try to describe why, it gets away from you. Just like when you try to describe literature, why does literature matter? It's actually difficult, but you know it. But it's interesting, and I think also it's hard to describe the importance of things that are multidimensional or like it has higher dimensionality. There is a way, Noam
right.
Chomsky kind of once said something along the lines of basically, you can't teach a pig astrophysics, right? But would that mean astrophysics was false? No, and you kind of this idea that, and there's something about sometimes when you're trying to describe why philosophy matters, you can almost feel like a dog trying to learn algebra or trying to remind you, like you're trying to teach yourself. Like it's almost like a dog teaching themselves algebra in a certain way, in the sense that you know it, but you're grasping in it. It's very difficult because you're trying to put into words something that is fundamentally experienced. So there's an interesting kind of dilemma there where whereas I guess what I want to say is when you're dealing more with science or engineering, you really don't have the problem of language failing to capture ideas because you're ultimately going to have formulas and instructions. There's something about the STEM fields that less has to deal with the problem that ideas are not experienced. Whereas when you get into the other fields like the humanities, the problem of words and experiences being different is something you're perpetually dealing with. And when you're asked, why does philosophy matter? You're in a place of putting into words something you've experienced. Whereas if I ask you, why do you think this bridge is not going to fall? I can just show you the formulas. It's very easy to know. Let me put it this way. If somebody asks you, how do you know this bridge isn't going to fall? Or how do you know this experiment is going to work or give you the results? You kind of know what to say in the sense of you go get the formulas or you go get the blueprints. There's not a kind of where do we even begin feeling. Whereas when you're dealing with anything that at its heart is dealing with the words are not experiences problem, that there's always this kind of having to re-say it, rethink it, redo it, revisit it. And it's very interesting that the humanities uniquely wrestle with that problem, I think. And actually, that problem is why the humanities are always at risk of being dismissed. Because even though if you get it this time, tomorrow you may forget, or maybe this generation gets it, but the next generation can't articulate it to themselves in a way that makes it plausible. And so they let it go. Because there's also something about philosophy, if it's fundamentally tied to the language act, speaking, where you're trying to make something, one of the things I want to say, like let's say in Christianity, when you say death has no sting, like you believe this. But then there's a way in which you need to speak in order to feel like you believe it, like to make it plausible to you or to make it alive to you. There is an interesting way in which many thinkers have associated language with killing a thing. Like if I try to say something, I kill it. It kills the expression. But actually, there's a way in which language is needed to make the thing alive. Like if I stop talking, then the topic actually dies to me. Like if I stop languaging or exploring, what does it mean that death has no sting? Then actually death does come to feel like it has a sting. And there's something interesting there. There does seem to be a form of speaking that kills the thing, which I think is the speaking of discourse and Kafka-likeness we get into in Belonging Again, the speech that is trying to perfectly articulate the thing. Whereas voicecraft and philosophical dialogue and rhetoric, all the same thing, is the speech. And it makes me think, and I was just speaking with C-Money about this, Christopher Master Pietro, he was talking about there's speaking where you're trying to perfectly get at the words and the ideas that kind of kills speaking. But then there's speaking that's more of a kind of pointing to or grasping at, and the words fail, but you're grasping at it. I think that's more of the character of philosophical speech, which could tempt you to then go, oh, well, speech fails, so who cares? But actually that failure matters. That trying and failure really matters. And there's something about that trying and failing that helps you come to terms with or to feel more confident in, like the experience of the grasping at or trying to language or to trying to speak actually helps you grow in something. And I think we've been trapped for most of history in a dialectic between speech that fails or speech that doesn't say what you want to say and silence. And we've responded to speech that doesn't say what you want to say with silence or mathematics, quote unquote, STEM language. And we've just been going back and forth. But this third sublation of speech, which is what I think philosophy is the speech of, is this voicecraft, is this orbiting, is this speech that is getting at something and restating it and retrying and retrying and retrying. And this is, I guess, my point. I think that effort heals. I think that effort actually heals grief or is actually necessary to come to terms with grief. I actually think that it is very hard to heal from grief without this kind of voicecraft, with this kind of speaking. And I think philosophy is, you got to have philosophy to do this kind of speaking. It's no different than we've talked about philosophy being necessary or very, very important for relationships. Relationships die without communication and speaking. Why? But a relationship forms in the speech act that has this poetic character, this pointing to but failing. Like a couple that is, if you're holding, if the speaking has to be perfect or every word is information, communication dies because it feels like labor, not play. And there's something about that kind of speaking that kind of strengthens the relationship. There's something about speaking in this way that I think heals because it moves something. Maybe that, and I'll throw to you here, these are just opening thoughts, but there's something that where that death has no sting. But unless you go through the speaking in this way, it's hard to feel like it doesn't, or it's something but you don't understand, or it's something but it's something you just accept, but maybe you never feel healed from it, right? So there's something, I think, for me about the philosophical way of speaking that is tied to actually not ignoring grief or repressing grief, but actually kind of healing with grief. Maybe you keep the scars. In a sense, you always keep the scars, but the scars transform into evidence of a life that was heroically lived. But there's something about the speaking act that is tied to that. Let me throw it back to you.
That's all really interesting. I guess I was just thinking about it's such a tremendous point, an important point where the failure is kind of its success in a way. Like it does feel Hegelian a little bit. Right? Like doesn't he talk about the concept of like the failure. It's like in the failure is the
Oh yeah.
knowing, or like
Yeah.
the,
Yeah.
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 Um, so, what's funny is that words always make a type of choice. Like they, like for example, when you're saying, the interesting thing is that as soon as you can hear the phrase, and know the phrase and read the phrase and learn the phrase, death has no sting. The funny thing is, though, your immediate reaction, especially in encountering death, is to say, but it does sting. It does hurt.
Yeah.
It does feel, it does. So it immediately is making a claim that then retroactively makes you think about it in terms of it feeling like a sting. Like maybe you didn't even think about sting as the language for it. Okay. You maybe thought of other words or other like language for it, but then when language makes a choice of how it's going to frame something, you can also then very quickly, like it sets up a framework which you can contest with your emotions or your experience and at the same time acknowledge as a potential, right? So like it fails and it succeeds in making a type of framework. And I think that, yeah, philosophy might be unique in that it can start to, I don't want to say pick apart, but it can do that, a suspension of judgment, even with a claim about something that you are experiencing, and also doing your best to sort of suspend judgment about it as well, even though your body and your emotions and your reactions are going to be like already making sort of making judgments in the sense of it'll already judge it as difficult, or again, painful, or confusing, or whatever it is. So what I'm trying to say is that like the philosophical potential, I think, is that, as you're saying, it affords the opportunity to do this work of tearing with the failure and success of a certain articulation, which is a choice, which is actually one of our greatest gifts and potentials, not just potentials, but our greatest realities as humans, is to make choice, right? And to create certain terms, or to create certain frameworks to understand things. And also to give ourselves a potential, it's like when we talk about social imagination, right? It's the ability to also talk about the fact that something can be, like, in a sense, what that can almost mean is like it can still bite, but it can't leave the sting that then, like you continually, just takes over. I'm just thinking about like a bee sting or something, right? Like, of course it hurts, but then there's also the process of it, like allowing it to be tainting you with like a little bit of that poison or whatever, right? Because that's what a sting is from a bee or a bug, where it's almost like there's a bite still, but an incorruptibility or something to the integrity of yourself, or something like that. But yeah, I guess I'm trying to point to the fact that, yeah, certain words can almost set things up in a framework that seem almost absurd, but also offer a social imagination. And philosophy allows you to be able to do the work of tearing with that bothness, right, of the absurd truth, or something like that. And I wonder if you don't, like, if there's not that ability to kind of reprocess through language itself, whether it's through your own writing, or maybe conversation or reading. Reading can be another form too, where you don't know what to do with the framework, right? Because it's almost like you could only just feel like, well, then I guess I shouldn't be hurting about this, right? If it shouldn't sting. But really, there's something to me where, again, that reworking with that, and then the contextual understanding of that particular phrase, is allowing you to do a greater work of like integration of that grief, right? That then you, like you said, you live with, but you live like you live out in some way. I don't know how to, if yeah, that's kind of the language that's coming to mind. But yeah, I'll send it back your way. But I think there is something very unique about, well, I'll say one more thing. There is something unique about language itself, and how I do think that the fact that philosophy in general has kind of been, I don't know, it's almost been, I don't want to say severed, that maybe is too strong of a word, but I do think it's almost been relegated to, again, sort of more like just, there's a place for this, obviously, but like the historical studies versus like rhetoric, right? Like
Yeah.
how the fact that we are speaking beings and this changes everything. That's been detrimental. And I do think that's like a desire to resurrect that, or bring that back to the like the pulse of humanity, or something like that, where that could be so yeah, so helpful and profound and important and necessary because it's doing that work anyway. Like language is doing that work anyway. But when we realize that like the philosophical act is actually so linked with language and not in some sort of like erudite way, but really just about like again, this tearing with the absurdity and the truth of words or framework. That's what's really important. And then yeah, the I was thinking about something that I saw that Recovering Overthinker had posted about like the fact that like going with the flow is actually not like there's a risk in going with the flow all the time because like it's kind of, and I can attest to this, like I've definitely felt that it was almost a gift to go with the flow. And there can be in the sense that you're not like hyper picky about stuff, right, where you get so fixated on how everything has to go that then you're like not able to just accept that there are things outside of your control. But the what he was highlighting, which I thought was so important, is this idea of like choice and how that, again, what I was saying about the choice of words, right? Choice is so unique to us as humans. And you actually, if you don't do the work of stepping into your full responsibility as a human and as an adult even, or a person of your choices, then you will not be able to direct the flow. Like the flow that you go with the flow is really just think about like being in the tussle of the waves where you're like, just when you get up, you're like knocked back down again. It's like not very productive. And then you also feel like it's exhausting sort of thing versus you making choices to direct the flow of energy is still allowing a flow, but it's more so that is through you versus you just being caught up in the flow. And I guess I'm trying to think about how I'm just thinking about that in terms of choice being so important. And maybe there's something, at the heart of grief that is like this strange tension between what you don't choose and what you choose to do in the midst of it or something like that. So anyways, that's a couple of things. I'll throw it back your way.
No, I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking Luke and Gurdjieff and this idea that if energy doesn't flow, it's going to bottle up and blow up and you have problems. So there's something about keeping energy moving. There is something about the philosophical speaking act that keeps energy moving. So it doesn't bottle up and blow up or risk problems or something like that, right? Or you have to kill your ability to channel energy maybe, and then that can be a dying unto death kind of thing. So there's something. Now it's also interesting because the key to philosophical speech is this associational logic, this ability to have this lead to this to lead this, and there's this kind of lack of repetition in a certain way. Now over time, of course, there's repetition, but it can gain a new quality and stuff like that, and there's a role for repetition, but there's something about speech that feels like it's going somewhere that I think is unique to energy flow. And I think without philosophy, it is hard to have speech not become repetitive. And I think once it becomes repetitive, it no longer helps the energy flow. It feels stuck. Well, that's the point. Like you're saying the same phrases. Death has no stink, or or this too will pass, or things. And this, but there's a kind of stuckness in that language. You can kind of feel. And my argument would be that use of language doesn't heal because the healing seems to come from movement and energy flow, right? Now, the temptation then is to say, well, the name of the game then is to forget about it, to look away, don't pay attention. And then you can move, forget about it. You can move beyond the grief, right? But this feels more on the side of repression in a bad way, a bad kind of repression, versus a reef kind of necessary for society not to explode. So the question is, how do you get a movement and a flow of energy that is not ignoring? And again, I think if we look at the philosophical dialogue, and I think this applies to everything, we've talked about it, and, Vervaeke or Schindler, DC Schindler, who's had talks with Corey and Ken, there's this idea in the Platonic dialogue that what's happening is a kind of orbiting. So you're everything's looking at this, but you orbit it. So you're moving around it. And also that may make vertical spiraling in a way, right? Philosophy allows you to orbit things where you are moving, but you're not looking away from the thing, right? So I think basically the only way we heal from grief or integrate grief is we orbit the grief, not forget about it and move beyond, but also you don't want to stay in place looking at it because then you feel stuck or you don't know how to move on. And it's kind of like you only want to move on from grief as a spiral. You don't want to move on away from it. Right? But then there's another sense in which you do want to move on from it. So what do we mean? It's almost like a vertical. where it's not that you look away, but you actually learn how to move beyond the grief by facing the grief, right? Like the
Mhm.
moving
Mhm.
beyond it allows a
Mhm.
spiral kind of orbiting where
Yeah.
you actually gain dimension. Like you gain a
Yes.
vertical that you may never get. Like if grief gives you a vertical that you wouldn't have gotten without the grief, that is kind of where grief becomes a gift, where you honor the grief and you don't forget,
Mhm.
but then that death or grief actually is affording new life. So how does grief
Yeah.
give way to
Yeah.
new life? Well,
Exactly.
if it can add a vertical, that can do it. And this kind of gets into where many theologians and
Mm.
pastors and others warn that in our society that kind of takes the dead and gets rid of them, or the sick or elderly, and we then people no longer take the existential question seriously, and
Yeah.
that's an issue. And so there's this idea that death can actually be really important so that you live
Yeah.
with character and virtue, and that would be adding dimension. Like if death makes you gain virtue or preparation, you gain virtue. But there's something about philosophy, and then I'll throw it to you. There's something about the philosophical act that lets you orbit a topic, because in a
Yeah.
philosophical dialogue, you say, well, what is death? Why does it mean that death has no scene? Then you associate with a topic like
Mhm.
beauty and you come back. There's this
Yeah.
movement that is occurring, but it's
Mm.
all facing death. It's all looking at death. But so you're moving, and then as you get new insight, you begin going vertical. And now you
Mm.
have dimension you wouldn't have otherwise had, that actually
Mhm.
then any development in your character or the like you get is a testament to the grief, not ignoring the
Mm.
grief.
Definitely.
The move is moving with grief or moving because
Exactly.
of grief, as opposed to moving on from grief. It's
Yeah.
moving thanks to grief. Freedom with, freedom in. It's moving thanks to grief as opposed to from of it. And I think that
Yeah.
dimensionality is only afforded by philosophical dialogue. And that would apply to romantic issues or fights or disagreements. Like if you want to redeem grief or redeem conflict, you need to
Mm.
orbit
Mm.
it. Like it would seem to me that redemption in general is not
Mm.
possible without an orbiting structure, because
Mhm.
redemption is not ignoring, it's having the thing orient you in a new way. And that's when you then redeem it. And then you could also say sublate it. So those were thoughts, but let me give it to you.
No, that was very good. That was wonderful. And it made me think a lot about what you and Jockin will talk about with memory, right? The idea of like you have to have memory to be able to do that work, right? Um, and also I think it's important what's being said too, because actually to have a philosophical consideration of how to move with grief or to be moved by grief is important, because otherwise somebody could think, well, if I continue moving and I don't just do the head on looking at it, not moving, then oh, that's like disrespectful to the source of that, like to the to the one who has passed, or to the situation that incurred the grief, if that makes sense. Like it's it's important to think about it. I think the philosophy helps because you kind of think, okay, well let's just take it for let's just assume that maybe that is the way that one ought to orient themselves. Well, what are the fruits, right? Like what are the fruits of just staring and not moving and refusing to move on because you've believed that moving on, really it's moving with, like we said. Yeah, moving on might actually be wrong if you're just going to forget and just try to run away from it, right? But yeah, moving with could still be thought of as not uh, staying in a proper orientation to um to the locus, if you will. and and that's a thought, that like that's an idea, right? And it's probably grounded in a lot of one's own personal experiences, or like their own insecurities or their own history, their patterns. um because it's almost like, well, aren't I, if I yeah, it's almost this feeling of like, if to do the moving with process, doesn't that mean I have to let something go? So really, it's funny because it's like there could be that feeling of I should just keep staring at it without movement to honor the locus, right? The person who's passed, or um the source of the reason for the grief. Um, Not that it's a person, but you get what I'm saying, the situation that occurs because of the loss. But really, it's so much about like one's own, in a sense, ego at that point, because you're saying you're not going to move on and you're going to stare at it for the sake of that person or that situation, but really it's really um it's really more so about how you feel as it relates to that locus of the grief, if that makes any sense. So what I'm trying to say is that you could say, okay, well, let's try to give that some credit for a second and see if that's better than moving with the grief, because maybe that honors the person more, right? Or the loved one more. But does it? Because in a sense, like, you've fixed them and you fixed yourself, and now you don't allow, like you said, this you don't allow death to move into life, death to pass into life. And so yeah, and I actually, like, I'll say a specific example because it struck me, because I have one time encountered, and look, I'm sure everybody does it to a degree, like it's something you have to kind of fight because you're in the process. Like the moving will happen, and then sometimes you'll stop and be like, oh no, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, right? And then you have to kind of remind yourself, like, no, death does move into life, and this is a part of honoring that person actually, and all of that. So, but I remember, like, encountering somebody who had chosen to wear black for the rest of their life because of a loss of someone in their life, and they kept that person's room exactly the same for the rest of their life, and that was their choice. Like, I'm not trying to discredit it. It's just that was their choice, right? That was their choice that they made. But there were things that came up in that person's life that disintegrated because of the choice. Like it was, and you could say, well, maybe that was just something else, or that had something to do with it. Maybe, but again, you kind of can only go off of the fruits, and you can't really judge. You're just trying to do a work of assessment of, like, what is the proper orientation to the locus of grief. And what I want to say is that it struck me so much, the way that I saw this person make a choice in that situation, and I understand it. Like, I can, in a sense, you have to respect people's choices. But it really struck me in a sort of how do I put this, in a way that was like, there's just something that felt stuck. Like we were talking before earlier about, like, the stuckness and how the Philosophical Language Act helps you get unstuck, right? Of course, they did choose to sort of freeze themselves in time, because that was the best way that they could feel still close to that person who they loved so much. And so, but it did have ramifications in that person's life in terms of how it affected her other relationships, etc. And yeah, in a sense, maybe but she felt this was the best way to honor that person. So again, people, you still have to make your choices here, but there is a way in which philosophy, to me, does the act of, like, let's step back and let's try to see what are the fruits of that, and what type of fruits are you going to make a choice to go after and to live for, because it will matter, because it will have ripple effects to everything else in your life. So yeah, it was something that struck me so much that I remember, like, writing stuff down about this, and yeah, this was many years ago, but anyway, there are different, like, orientations to the locus of grief, and so yeah, but the suggestion here, the move with, is actually again, it's not really a place to judge. The person's trying to do their best through that situation, but in terms of why you may want to make a choice to do the moving with grief, is for the sake of actually more life, not just for yourself, which can kind of feel selfish, right? Well, I like, how can I keep living when somebody else who I love so much died? It just doesn't make sense, right? But there's a way in which, like, you wanted them to live because life is worth living, right? Life is beautiful. So you can't counteract that by then saying I shouldn't carry on or whatever, I shouldn't, because then you sort of undercut the very thing that you are mourning, the reason for why you are mourning, if that makes any sense. So it's just interesting the way the brain works, and how, you'll talk about the brain as the frenemy, but I think it does these types of moves. But yeah, ultimately what I would say is that this moving with grief does actually feel like, if you want to honor somebody's life, and the fact that you wanted them you desired for them to live longer, to know them more, all of that, it's like you actually have to continue to honor that desire in choosing to move with grief for the sake of life, for the sake of death, again, moving into life. So that was a lot. And maybe I was a little vague on the personal example of what I encountered, but I hope that, to me, I just want to do that because, again, it's showing the meta, like, I'm trying to kind of show the meta of what philosophy does in encountering the reality of how we handle things in life, real things in life that are, challenging. So I'll throw it back your way. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it's a tricky subject in different ways.
Yeah,
But even for it to be a tricky subject means you've engaged in philosophy as opposed to just
yeah,
absorbed kind of response, right? And
yeah.
there is a question of how often responses to grief are absorbed. They're not really something that is even a person's own. It just is something that
Mm,
they feel they should do or they've seen done or it kind of feels
mm,
right.
mm,
And that actually
mm,
then that's what they do. And there's a way in which you want your choice of your response to grief to be yours, as opposed
mm.
to simply the response that was given to you because of the self-evident. Okay, it's self-evident, but is it yours? And maybe it's not so self-evident, but that would take philosophy. There's something about wanting, it's important that your response to grief is yours. Like it's fully chosen, not and there's a way in which you say people choose, excuse me, people choose different responses to grief. But there's another way in which I'm not so sure. I think most responses to grief are what the system does or what the ritual is or what seems right. Like it seems right that the way you would honor someone's death is to not be able to function after they're gone, because wouldn't that be evidence? And that's almost like the Tennyson poem In Memoriam or something like that, right? But then this is the question, is that true? Is it true that you honor a life better? And if you say, well, it's just a matter of opinion, well, there's something interesting here, because whose opinion? And because the person you're honoring is gone. So it's not their opinion, and yet it's supposed to honor them. But then how do you
Exactly.
know it would honor them, because you don't know their opinion, right? Unless they wrote it down, like they put it down. So there's a way in which when you're deciding, say, if someone passes away, what is the best way to honor them, they're not there to tell you. And
Right.
so that is something you've assumed, right? And so there's some, maybe leaving the room and never changing anything and wearing black would be the best way to honor them, because they've written that down. But that would need to be arrived at through orbiting. Like you need to really
Yeah,
orbit through that. And
yeah,
I would also say that there's other questions to be had. If you leave the gravestone ever, is that dishonoring them? Like, what would it mean to adequately not move on from, right? Like, do you need to quit your job and be there 80% of the day at the gravesite? What is it like if you wear all black, but are you eating the same meal every day that you had before they died? Are you eating their favorite meal every day, right? Like, what is it you can change and what is it you can't change? Why not change? Why leave just the room the same? Why not the entire house? You see, you start
mm,
getting into the problem is the moment you start saying there are determinations or things that mean you have not moved on and that is the right thing to do. How do you decide that? On what level and to what degree? And why does that equal not moving on from versus something else, right? Like you end up in a kind of spurious problem where there could then almost be grief competition or something like that, right? So there's something about you're automatically at risk of something problematic when you start playing the game of what signifies proper honoring of the dead. Like the moment you start doing that, like how do you do that? On what standards and why? And again, there's something about philosophy that would lead you to very much ask that question, of which may then free you. I think people can feel a certain bondage in being afraid of moving on and it being bad. They're like, they feel a bondage of dishonoring the person and not wanting to dishonor the person. We're actually realizing that spurious problem I was just pointing to could actually start liberating you from that bondage. I guess I want to say grief times is when people can feel a kind of bondage, like they can feel kind of trapped in how they act and what they do, because that could be dishonorable. I think also people are afraid of being seen as moving on by others. They're afraid of being viewed as failing to adequately grieve, because that would mean they didn't love them and they don't want to be seen that way. So there's a nervousness there. I think people really in pressure situations feel remarkable bondage. they can, like on what to do and what's the proper thing to do and what's fitting. And the problem is proper and fitting are all philosophical questions. What's fitting, we had an OG Rose about that, is a philosophical question. But if you don't have philosophy, you can't answer that. And so you're
Right.
ultimately just going to be responding to impulse, feelings, what people say in passing, and you're then in a
Yeah.
kind of whirlwind of possible responses to grief that then are really not your own. And I guess I want to say, and then I'll give it to you, although I know we don't have too much time. Um,
Mm.
if you decide that never changing a room and wearing black the rest of your life is fitting, it needs to be on the other side of philosophy. It needs to be on the other side of orbiting.
Yeah.
And I think there is something interesting about saying the unchanging is the true, because that would mean space is more real than time. Like you are
Yeah.
saying that if something doesn't change, that makes it more
Yeah.
authoritative than if it does change, right?
Right.
When that would mean you're conflating eternal with not changing, as opposed
Mhm.
to, I would argue, honoring grief. Like honoring is to actually become something you otherwise never would have been. Like
Mm. Yeah.
I think you honor the dead by being courageous. Maybe there's something you're scared to do, and now you're going to
Mm.
do it. Now there's
Mm.
something you always knew you should have done, but you haven't been doing, and now you're going to do it.
Mm.
I think you grieve properly by becoming courageous. Like if you want to
Mm.
honor them, have their death push you and motivate you and make, in a sense, make you make yourself do that which you've not been doing and know you should be, or to change in a way that is more virtuous. I think the correct response to grief is to grow in virtue, to actually become something you otherwise wouldn't have become, to say, what is it in me that I'm not facing or running from? And
Yeah.
maybe you're running from being seen as someone who doesn't move on, and therefore it takes courage to wear black all the time. That is a possibility, of course, but you
Yeah.
need to really, really ask yourself if that's the spirit of what you're doing. Is it in courage, or is it in another motivation of a different kind?
Yeah.
And so, for me, you honor, and I'll give it to you. I think there's something to be said about the proper way to grieve is to then muster courage in that which you've been avoiding. Like to actually have it be something that in its honor, you are now going to have a courage or face something or develop a virtue you haven't. And
Mm.
that can be, or to find more beauty or to encounter more beauty. So, I mean, I know we stress courage often, but I think it is the virtue that enables all the virtues. And I do think that Mr. Ebert, when he said that the meaning of life is courage, is really getting at a lot that is
Yeah.
correct. And I think it is almost always the case that the proper response is a development of courage. Like whatever the
Mm.
thing is, there's something about a development of courage that's central. But let me
It,
give it to you.
yeah. I am. I just will close up here with this statement that I think what you're saying on courage is so important because again, like, and a person needs to, I think philosophy will help a person determine and decipher that in themselves, like, uh, what they need to be courageous about. Because, again, like we said, actually moving on too rapidly might be a person not being courageous because they're not dwelling with the reality of the grief, right? But then, not being able to move with grief and allow it to change you is also that also might be being like not courageous, to just say, I'm not going to learn to change, let it change me. As a person, I'm going to stay fixed in it. So yeah, I think courage is a really good way to think about it. And to me, it relates to fear, because it's like, okay, fear is a litmus test of like, okay, what am I afraid of, right? Am I afraid? If because fear and courage are so linked. So basically, if you're not being courageous, you're being fearful. So how you process grief, um, and some people might think that's, but I think it's a very real. I think it is a real, very real thing where people can, again, it's a lot about allowing the ego and the way that we want to be perceived to. Your ego is going to really focus on how you're being perceived or how you might be perceived. Even by the one who has passed, the loved one who has been passed, right? It's an interesting thing that the mind can do, but really, like when we allow the death and the grief to change us, then we remember that we also have to allow a type of death of the ego, really, in order to be able to um, grow in further virtue and allow that that honoring of the person. It's like that's probably one of the greatest tributes is that a person and their courage in facing death is able to make you be able to face that which you are afraid of and to encourage. So yeah, so I was breaking up a little bit there with the internet, but I just think what you said was so good, and it's a helpful way to navigate, and I do think there are like definitely ways in which um the absorbed ways of dealing with grief will still occur, but to be able to take the time to allow yourself to really process in your own particularity, I think can be a helpful thing, and also a way to allow you to face and evolve or transform further in other areas of your life. So again, more life can abound from death. It's death into life. So yeah, that I just thought that was all very good.
Yeah, and I guess what I want to say in the same way that in the fittingness conversation, there's this idea that there are forms of courage that could be destrato because you say, I'm going to burn everything to the ground. And there's something about you find the response, you should ask yourself regarding grief, not am I grieving enough, but if I'm developing courage. But the courage you need to develop is one that maintains openness to the other, not that cuts off from the other. And one of the issues that can happen if, say, you wear black all the time or don't change anything, you start suggesting there's a kind of sadness that no one can access, that there's something about you that can't be accessed and is cut off from other people. You have a kind of private, deep grief that no one will really ever get. And the problem with that is that if it is fitting for things to be open and creative, and that courage needs to serve that openness to the other, not be the
Right.
courage of isolation that isolates, because then that form of courage is not good, and arguably not courage, because then you're afraid of losing that thing that you're holding on to, and you're kind of afraid of not being seen as grieving, or something like that. So there's a kind of possessive spirit there. There's something about you need to ask the question in grief, like what would be the courageous way to face the grief and maintain openness to otherness, like maintain open to other people or maintain openness to a new understanding of what would honor this person. Because the moment you don't do that, then there's an isolation that is occurring in favor of enclosure, right? So it is important. So I guess the takeaways here is instead of asking, am I grieving enough or in the right way? There's a question of, am I courageous before the grief in a way that maintains open to the other and otherness? But then how to do that exactly would require live discernment, philosophy, orbiting, and stuff like that.
The orbiting will always entail remembering that person and what occurred. And then also, courage doesn't mean that there's never tears. Like, of course, courage, it's like they say, like, you don't do it. When you're doing something courageous, you may still feel afraid, but you still do it anyway. You know what I mean? You do it like in spite of it, or with it, or something like that. Like you face it by moving through it with it. So yeah, courage isn't necessarily like like it's not merely
no, it's not the absence
something
of
like
fear.
that.
No.
Yeah, and it's not the absence of emotion. It's just that it's a decision to face that which you would rather not.
It's an orientation in the midst of that makes all the difference, because the way the world is profoundly tied to our orientation to it. But always good to speak with you. Always
good, Daniel. Always good. Thank you so much. Love you, babe.
Love you.